let me please kindly ask you, Excellencies, to come back to the stage for the panel. And let me also invite the other speakers. Odeta Barbullushi, resident professor at the College of Europe in Tirana, a foreign policy expert, academic, and former diplomat as well. Good to have you with us. Rumena Filipova, chairperson at the Institute for Global Analytics in Sofia, with an extensive experience in the think tank sector. Good to have you with us. Valbona Zeneli, a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center and at the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, Transatlantic Security Initiative. And our moderator is Tamás Baranyi, the strategic director of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs with a special expertise in foreign political strategy and transatlantic relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Since we are running very short on time, actually, for such a huge topic, and I was just wondering while sitting in the audience that most of our audience should be more acquainted with Central European issues, and honestly, for some of us, the Balkans is a little bit further away, and the very complicated strategic situation is not always very much understood. So what if we, for the first round of questions, we would just zoom out a little bit and would talk about the very title of this panel. So what is the strategic situation in the Western Balkans? I know, Mr. Ambassador, that you talked about this, specific larger framework extensively during your expose. But what if you just highlight some of the things that you have in mind about that, and then we could have a reverse round of this question. And please be succinct, because again, we are half an hour to talk, and there's a lot of things to talk about. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot. Maybe the key point would be that the dynamics and transformation in the Western Balkan countries remains a kind of a two-way street, meaning that the European Union, the European member states should, and the institutions should provide better and more accurate and more direct support towards reaching the criteria, reaching the standards, reaching the principles. But on the other hand, there should be this both-way street. The countries should try to accept the criteria, not to discuss about criteria all the time, but to enter into and to fulfill the lesson. I mean, we did it in Croatia. That was like that. There was an ongoing discussion whether to take this or that. This is not a menu, and just pick and choose. This is a set of criteria of how do you function. Is it left side driving the car or right side? But there is a rule, and after that rule you should follow and proceed. And it seems easy, but it's not easy. But if there is a will, there is a way.
Everything is easier said than done. Yeah. Madam Ambassador, from a country which is outside the EU now, do you see it a similar way or, very differently?
It should be a similar way. As my colleague said, yes, the criteria should not be discussed, but, applied. But then there is, unfortunately, no one-size-fits-all because of the internal complexities of each and every candidate country. As you could hear from my initial talk, from my introductory, Bosnia-Hercegovina is a highly complex country. And we do not ask for any, special position or special treatment. But definitely there are some things that simply has to be a product of internal conversation and internal capacities. And we highly appreciate all the friendly and goodwill support and the pieces of advice and knowledge, sharing the knowledge and best practices from all the countries who are wishing to see us within the EU. But again, some time ago there was a few other Western Balkans EU perspective conferences with very, very simple and indicative question. Does European Union really want us in? Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's also a question, but I think the mood has been changed a little bit. What is your take on the event?
Well, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for putting such a panel and locating it in the security, broader security conversation, because I think this is very important to look at the Western Balkans not only as a region which has caused issues of insecurity and instability for Europe, but I think increasingly as a region which also contributes to European security. So I think it depends from which capital you answer that question. Is the Balkans going from bad to worse? And I say that, and I would like to maybe to start with a rather positive note, or more positive note, than what we have heard this morning. And I say that because I flew from Tirana yesterday, where only a couple of days ago the Summit of Leaders of European Political Community was organized, where we had over 52 delegations flying in Tirana to discuss issues of European security. Some of the questions that were referred to by this morning by Assistant Secretary General of NATO, Mr. Ruge. And I think that demonstrates two things. I think the first thing it demonstrates is that there is indeed a new awareness on the part of the EU that one cannot work with the Western Balkans business as usual. So one needs to accelerate cooperation with the Western Balkans. And we have seen that with, indeed, the opening of accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia, the granting of status of candidate status to Bosnia-Hercegovina. And in the case of Albania, we have indeed seen, and I say that from Tirana's perspective perhaps, rather than from the entire region's perspective, a rather acceleration of the process of EU accession since October last year, when the first cluster was open. And those of you who all come from EU accession field and policy know that that's very important, the opening of the fundamentals of the first cluster of chapters. So I think there are differences within the Western Balkans about the perspective of security and how this contribution of the region to European security is viewed. And I think some countries, to echo what the two distinguished ambassadors said with regard to also our own lessons as a region, I think some countries have realized sooner than others that this wave of enlargement will be and is primarily about security. And that's unlike the other waves of enlargement, like the enlargement of Central European countries that have been more of a sort of unifying Europe, but sort of that victory of the liberal paradigm, of the liberal free world, or the previous enlargement of the 90s, as we know, that were more about economics and about sort of expanding that area of wealthier European countries, or previous ones that have been about democracy. This is about security, and some countries, I think, have understood it quicker than others. Having said that, I think the differences between or among the countries of the Western Balkans have been accentuated by the current geopolitical context. So I think in that regard, and I'll come back to that and perhaps also as a response to possible questions, that in itself I think poses a challenge which we need to address as a region when it comes to security and political cooperation. And there are a number of challenges that were already mentioned here by the keynote speakers. The first group of challenges are internal, related to the complexity of state-building processes in the region, Bosnia-Herzegovina being a case in point, but also we have the case of North Macedonia, which indeed, even though the question at the moment, the most pressing question concerns bilateral issue, it is primarily an issue related to identity, or an issue related to history and to the legacy of state-building. But there are also, and as were mentioned again by Assistant Secretary Ruge this morning, challenges that have been there but have been accentuated or exacerbated by the current geopolitical context, like what we see now with the deepening of divisions within countries, with the acceleration, exacerbation of nationalistic divisive language, or language which indeed challenges the state-building framework of not just Dayton, but also elsewhere, of also current international agreements like Prespa and even Ohrid in the case of North Macedonia. The other, I think, challenges which are again of internal nature are socioeconomic. We touched upon this morning some of the issues regarding convergence, or rather divergence, socioeconomic divergence of the region with the rest of the EU. And what we have seen in the past few years with these countries accelerating or moving at least since 2022 in the accession path has not quite been mirrored in acceleration of socioeconomic standards, or sort of a bridging of that gap between the region and the rest of the EU. It's a very different situation from what we have seen in the times ahead or just before accession of the countries of Central Eastern Europe. And the economists in the room, I think, know better than I do what I mean by that. We do not see yet a level of preparedness of the EU to actually absorb these countries, or to be ready when these countries will indeed be members, as the rhetoric has it. In that particular, I think I'd like to make just a very quick caveat, like in the context of the growth and reform plan for the Western Balkans, unless that provides a platform for the discussion of the next multi-annual financial instrument, that will, I fear, will only remain a one-time quick fix for the region. The other, I think, challenge remains with regard to the presence of third actors, and I think we'll have an opportunity to discuss that more in depth. Yes. That will be the next question. So what can the EU do? If I can only say two things before you move on to the other speakers. One, I think, is, again, enlargement policy, as was mentioned here by the distinguished ambassador of Croatia. It's very important that the so-called momentum of 2022 produces results. Citizens do not really know and may even care less about opening chapters, benchmarks, intermediate benchmarks, and the technical side of things. What we need is actually a very clear political will on the part of the EU to have success stories, to have one or two countries of the region who have met the criteria to become members. The second, I think, step is very important, to include these countries, all of them of the Balkans, in the discussion about resilience and competitiveness of the EU. Indeed, browsing through the competitiveness report, the region doesn't come up. And again, going back to the discussion of convergence, if the EU is serious about taking this region in, the discussion about how these countries can strengthen their competitiveness and be part of this endeavor of the EU to become more competitive should be there. And a third one, maybe the other speakers may, is how to rebuild trust in EU and the West. And I'll leave it there. Very happy to respond to questions later on.
Thank you very much. And Rumena, what is your take on the issues?
You're taking really my cue from the title of this panel. It's about the strategic quality of this region, and I would argue that we see a lot of strategic fragmentation in this region, which is not very large by geographical standards, because it's divided into a number of sub-regions which have their distinct political trajectories and orientations. Of course, on the one hand, we do tend to focus on the Western Balkans, which receives the bulk of the international attention in many ways, and it has been characterized by the seemingly never-ending process of Europeanization and European integration, the unresolved legacies of the past, and also relative economic decline in comparison to the other countries in the region. But on the other hand, of course, we have adjacent Bulgaria and Romania, which followed their own distinct paths since 1989. 1989 of Euro-Atlantic integration, there was a degree of convergence of the international and domestic processes between those countries, while they diverged, I would say, somewhat deliberately from the Western Balkans, frequently presenting themselves as islands of peace. Now, of course, at the same time, there has been a degree of discrepancy between Bulgaria and Romania themselves, as recently Romania has become much closer to Central Europe, in a way, distancing itself from the Balkans, becoming a key ally of Ukraine, building relations with Poland, and really becoming a key strategic area of the eastern flank of NATO. At the same time, Bulgaria has been distinguished by a significant degree of political instability and a lack of clear foreign policy vision. Of course, in the Balkans, we also have Greece and Turkey. Turkey being more focused on the Middle East as opposed to the Balkans, and in a way trying to balance between East and West. Greece, of course, focused on the Mediterranean. And last but not least, what Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine ushered in is the developing region of the Black Sea, and in particular the southern and western part of the Black Sea, which has been defined by the Russian threat and the maritime roles played by Bulgaria, Romania, and possibly Turkey in terms of bolstering NATO's defenses in that part of the Black Sea. So, to sum up, it's important to say that despite the significant spillover effects and interconnections between the countries of this region, we have to say that there has been a lot of strategic divergence, and the fact that the region has been subdivided into various sub-regions, which is something we need to take into consideration.
Thank you very much. And Valbona, finally, what is your take?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's great that we have Western Balkans as part of those important conferences. Maybe, I'd like to propose that in the future we consider, we change the name, we say Southeastern Europe. It has to be considered, bigger part, not just the Western Balkans, which has over history had a bad connotation. So talking about bigger regions, I think the Western Balkans is part of Southern Europe, part of Southeastern Europe. A lot was mentioned, everything was mentioned, so maybe I'll just make 3 quick points. We talked about the geopolitical necessity. That's what has changed in the last 2 years in the second invasion of Ukraine. But I see 3 dilemmas here going forward. The first one is a security dilemma. So we know that enlargement has been for the European Union the main tool for peace and security and prosperity. That's the tool that the European Union uses best. And so enlargement has been thrown immediately after the second invasion of Ukraine as one of the things that could change the situation. So my dilemma here is that with the security situation improving, enlargement might go back into becoming more technical. That's why we have to use momentum now to speed up the process. The second dilemma is geopolitical. And when I say geopolitical, every round of enlargement, the 5 rounds of enlargement, have been geopolitical rounds. It's been your geopolitical background. In this case, it's Ukraine that's pushing, it's driving the enlargement process. And the Western Balkans have caught the train that, Ukraine is the main driver there. However, Ukraine will be the most difficult country to become EU member for all the issues, because it's a big country, because of the security parameters, and also because of agriculture and all other issues. So I believe that that's the dilemma. Ukraine is pushing, but the Western Balkans have to be ready to get there quicker. The third dilemma is a dilemma of trust. It was a little bit mentioned. So the enlargement process is not just, bureaucratic, it's not just political or technical. It also involves a lot of fears, emotions, hopes. And when I talk about those emotions, are on both sides, are on the EU country side, but also on the Western Balkans or Southeastern European. So I think these are things that we have to be careful and keep momentum. As it was mentioned, the EU needs also success story. But my fear then, when we look at only some front runners, is that we might have a Western Balkans in the future that's a two-speed Western Balkans. And the first group will be the countries that are NATO countries of the Western Balkans, and the second one are those that have unresolved issues that are non-NATO countries. And that's the risk. But my last point will be that the narrative needs to be changed to also from the Western Balkans perspective, because we have to find, the region has to find ways to be part of transatlantic solutions, not only problems to the transatlantic community. And I say transatlantic because in all this conversation, we should not forget the important, the crucial role of the United States in the entire process, even to push and drive enlargement in the Euro-Atlantic institutions, not just EU, but also NATO. As we're standing here this week, we have a big event where most of the leaders of the region are traveling to Dayton for a big conference there. Now we have to see what's going to come up from that. Are we going to continue with the talk, or what will be the walk in changing the situation? I'll stop here.
Thank you very much for being succinct. The first round question took 20 minutes to answer, and I really appreciate you trying to be succinct, but it didn't really work out. And we have like 10 minutes to go, and I've received a couple of questions online just as well. I think one of them is for me, but most of them are targeting the external actors. So what if we go a second round and we try to be even quicker than before, please. And most especially, I would inquire about the role of Russia, which is always there, and this is what we mean largely when we say security, right? So how do you see the external actors with this emphasis? Mr. Ambassador, if you can go first.
It's always easy to speak first or last. I mean, okay, being
diplomatic ranks are such.
Yeah, on some sort of. Okay, but nevertheless, well, the role of Russia. Russia remains a factor, although they have their own priorities. So maybe in this very period of time, due to the priorities by themselves, maybe there's a room for additional attempts regarding further enlargement steps of the countries of the Western Balkans region. However, it will be an answer and a question without a very, very particular answer. But at least also in this very aspect, I think we should use the momentum and maybe to turn to the everyday job, not to think about more complex ideological and other aspects of the overall situation. Maybe to work on becoming closer to the criteria and achievements of the European Union would make a better solution than to cope with something which even the Union hardly copes.
Thank you very much. Madam Ambassador, in your speech you mentioned the need for sovereignty. So how do you see external actors?
Yes, the need for sovereignty is high, but of course Bosnia and Herzegovina is aware when once become a full member of the EU, some of the sovereignty will have to be given, away for the greater good and the EU agenda, of course. If you allow me just to mention, trust is there, but momentum, I'm afraid, has been lost. The process is taking too much time, and it was said many times by Bosnian and Herzegovina politicians that there should be, there cannot be, there must not be a vacuum in politics and geopolitical life of any of the states. And this very vacuum made by the EU reluctant position on speed accession of the countries of the region into EU have left some of the vacuum, filled in with other powers, not only Russia, but also Turkey and some others from the Middle East, China as well, and each and every of those countries are present in Bosnia and Herzegovina, either through energy projects, either through religious and cultural projects, and so on and so forth. We will see how it goes. I agree with my colleague that we should put away some of those ideology aspects and turn on, to a very concrete homework that we all have to do on both of the sides, on the side of Sarajevo and Brussels as well, and other countries, EU members as well. And but to speed up the process of starting and taking place of negotiation is a must. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Odeta, can you wrap up this very easy
Yeah,
and
very
uncomplicated
easy.
question?
Indeed. Well, I think sort of the more territorial threat that Russia poses was already elaborated. So I'll look at it mostly from the question of trust and credibility and the narrative or the story that we tell, the Europeans tell. The first, in terms of trust and credibility, I think it's very important for countries in the region which still seems to waver between the West and Russia. The EU must give clear message, and alignment in that respect is important. This is how I see it, particularly in the path towards EU accession. That clarity needs to be there, because otherwise what we'll see, as we are seeing in some countries of the region, I don't need to mention names, is that the public, the young people, move away, shift away from not just their national political elites, but also from the EU and what EU or Europe stands for. And that leads me to the question of narrative and the story. I think the main or greatest threat that Russia poses, or other actors, is not, like, again, about very tangible implications in this region, in this part of Europe, but about weakening the credibility of the West and Euro-Atlantic alliance and the strength of Euro-Atlantic institutions. And I think this is where we need to have a conversation, not about just investment in defense, as I think we had in the first panels of this morning, which are indeed very timely and important, but also to have a discussion about the antidote of that, of the discussion of threats and defense, which is about human capital, economic cooperation, and innovation. We cannot have in Europe one discussion without the other. That would mean we would be throwing away the main strength that we have and that we are known for, and that's where transformational power lies in. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rumena. Could you share your thoughts?
Yeah, so first of all, when it comes to Russian influence, it's important to mention that, of course, Russia has been the primary external meddling factor in the Balkans throughout history, and this happens through its impact on public attitudes and historical relations. So traditionally, Russia has stoked ethnic and historical animosities, both within Balkan countries, but also among them. So what we have here as an internal problem is the incomplete process of reassessment of the legacies of the past and an inadequate memory politics in the various countries of the Balkans, which of course manifests itself differently. So on the one hand, in the Western Balkans, there hasn't been a reassessment of the legacy of war of the 1990s, perhaps a rapprochement modeled on the one between Germany and Poland in the 1990s. And without this deep-seated process of reconciliation among the Western Balkan countries themselves, it is hard to see how there will be a sustained improvement in their bilateral but also regional ties, and these ties will be subject to intermittent flare-ups, as we see, and also they will be the subject of Russian meddling and a way of exerting its leverage over the region in terms of historical relations and the public mindset. Now, briefly, briefly, Bulgaria has a different problem than the Western Balkans when it comes to memory politics, because Russia is usually unjustifiably presented as a savior and a liberator, which has ostensibly had the country's best interests in mind. This has a very real impact, first of all, on the educational history in Bulgaria. And IJ, we published a report which reviewed all of the history textbooks that are used to teach history in the educational system in the country, and we see consistent pro-Russian biases, omissions of historical record, and pro-Russian proclivities overall. Now that has a very significant impact on young people's views, so it's not just a matter of content of historical material, but our public opinion polling shows that Gen Z in particular has some of the least critical views of authoritarian states, in particular Russia and also China. So below 20% of the young people think that these represent a threat. Now, I cannot help but mention, of course, China, because Chinese influence has been growing in the region, and again, it has manifested itself differently in different parts of the Balkans. When it comes to the Western Balkans in particular, China has been present through large-scale infrastructure projects, which have led to negative economic and financial repercussions, and they also have been, in a way, an indirect trigger of protests in Serbia, because it was exactly Chinese companies that were engaged in the reconstruction of the railway station and the canopy collapse, which triggered the protests. So there we may see the emergence of anti-Chinese sentiment in Serbia, which would be a change in the country. Now, let me say that in Bulgaria and Romania, we have seen a different process of Chinese influence gaining ground, not through large-scale infrastructure projects, but rather Chinese influence has been evident on the level of academic cooperation, local outreach, public diplomacy, and some business areas. So this is just to say that overall, Russia and China have acted differently in the Balkans. Their influence is different. Russia in particular on the level of public attitudes, historical relations, and China is gaining ground in economic areas and academia, importantly. And there has been a degree of interrelation in that local pro-Russian proxies have very often promoted Russian influence.
I would have a dozen questions because it's just heated up, but I think we have to move on because we are already run out of time. But no pressure.
No pressure.
I was told to keep this dynamic,
Okay.
and am I not?
Well, a lot was mentioned, but I think in the geopolitical context and in the great power competition context, the Western Balkans is not anymore the backyard of the European Union, but it's the front yard. This is, where it's happening. And I believe it will be a mistake if we keep talking about the foreign influences and how they are intervening and what are the consequences only in the region, and we do separate them from the European context. Whatever happens in the Western Balkans, it's part of the European geopolitical agenda, both be that with Russia or China. We discuss Russia more because it's more visible, but I believe that the Chinese, not by disrupting like the Russians do the Euro-Atlantic process for many countries, but through the standards that they bring, they are delaying, I would say, the EU enlargement process in many countries. And so I think this security and geopolitical context in the region depends on how the Ukraine conflict will be resolved. How long and lasting the peace in Ukraine will be, it will have a direct impact on what's going to happen in the Western Balkans. Russia can, in the very cheap, without not using many resources, but using internal problems and bilateral issues that the countries have, create artificially another, dispute or conflict. So that's why Ukraine, resolving the Ukraine conflict, Russian aggression in Ukraine, and finding a long-lasting peace deal will be crucial for the Western Balkans. And one last point, because we keep saying that people do not trust anymore, are becoming more skeptical when it comes to EU enlargement. I believe people, young people especially, are becoming skeptical about when their country will become an EU member. because they are all choosing the European Union by migrating in the European Union. They're not going to Beijing, they're not going to Moscow, they're coming to the Western European countries, they're going to the United States. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about the appeal of the European Union. I think it's lack of hope that their governments will be able to have them join the European Union as full members.
That's a very important distinction. Thank you very much. This is quite a cliffhanger for a conversation, but I encourage you to pose questions and continue discussions over the cafes, because this is what conference is really about. But for now, thank you very much for our guests to have taken part in this conversation, and please join me in applauding.